Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? On behalf of the American Journal of Bioethics, welcome to our second webinar. Today's topic is extremely timely and addresses a central challenge in COVID research and practice. For those interested in reading more, you can read all of our panelists' work in this month's issue of the American Journal of Bioethics, which has free access. And in fact, all of our COVID-related articles have free access. And please, as it says in the chat, if you have any questions, please use the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen. And please also vote for your favorite question, since that'll uplist any of the questions. We're used to thinking about the clear boundary between clinical research and clinical care. Clinical research to develop new treatments is an activity that aims through a rigorous protocol to establish the safety and efficacy of an intervention. Its goal is generalizable knowledge that tells us whether something really works and whether it's safe enough to use. It is ideally carried out through blinded, randomized clinical trials, sometimes referred to as phase 3 control trials. In contrast, clinical care is an activity that aims to benefit the individual patient where there's a reasonable likelihood of success. It typically involves providing interventions such as drugs that have been adequately vetted, for example, by the FDA through their approval process as a treatment that has been deemed to be safe and effective. Between the boundary of this distinction, there are several pathways for patients to gain access to unapproved drugs outside of clinical trials. These pathways include compassionate use or expanded access programs, where patients who are not enrolled in a clinical trial can get access to unapproved drugs for serious conditions where there are no proven therapies. The easiest examples of an EAP programs that are uncontroversial, of an expanded access program that's non-controversial, is when you have a drug that really has very good phase 3 randomized clinical trial data supporting it, but it's awaiting FDA approval, and there's a gap between the time when you have the data showing something works and the time when FDA approves it. But we've seen a push for expanded access programs even for drugs that are very early in the development pipeline, such as after phase 1 trials, which are typically very small trials to establish that there are no catastrophic safety issues. A second pathway for access to unapproved drugs outside of clinical trials is through emergency use authorization. Emergency use authorization is something that has rarely been used prior to the current pandemic. And this pathway allows the FDA to authorize the widespread use of a drug without meeting full approval criteria in cases of declared public health emergencies, such as in response to bioterrorism or during pandemics such as the one we currently face. Today's panel addresses at least 3 pressing issues raised by these alternative pathways. First, what sorts of evidence ought to be required to justify an emergency use authorization? Well, I suspect few would dispute the emergency use authorization granted to remdesivir and some of the PCR diagnostic tests for COVID developed at research universities like Stanford. There was a great deal of controversy over the emergency use authorization of hydroxychloroquine and more recently for convalescent plasma. Second, how do we avoid the problem of an expanded access program or emergency use authorization hindering clinical trials that would more definitively establish what actually works? Although over 100,000 people have been given convalescent plasma through the Mayo Clinic-led expanded access program, in spite of 100,000 people, they have failed to actually answer whether it offers clinical benefit. Now that it has been granted emergency use authorization status, the US will likely have to wait until the UK or Canada answers questions about whether it actually works and in what populations. Third, how do we fairly allocate drugs through these types of programs, given that there are a larger number of potential patients than there are drugs available? Critics of these programs point to many ways that access to these unapproved drugs are unfairly distributed. Compassionate use requires at a minimum advocacy from someone's physicians, who also has to be knowledgeable about what trials are available. It often requires social media campaigns to force companies to make the treatments available. Needless to say, this is a pathway for the few, not the many. Similar criticisms can be made about other pathways that are often only available to those getting care at academic medical centers. We are fortunate today to have 3 leading research ethics experts who have been tackling a lot of the issues raised by COVID, and especially these particular topics. Holly Fernandez Lynch, JD Masters of Bioethics, is an assistant professor of medical ethics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a Greenwald faculty scholar. She's the founder and co-chair of the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, or AERO, a collaborative effort to understand, evaluate, and improve IRB quality and effectiveness. Her scholarly work focuses on the ethics and regulation of research with human subjects, access to investigational therapies outside clinical trials, and also known as compassionate use, and FDA policy. Barbara Bierer, MD, is the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital, as well as Harvard's Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, a university-wide and collaborative effort to improve standards for the planning and conduct of clinical trials in the developing world. She's also a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and a hematologist-oncologist. In addition, she runs the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law program at the Harvard Catalyst, which is Harvard's Clinical Translational Science Award. Kate Spector-Baghdadi, JD, MBE, is a law and bioethics faculty in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Michigan Medical School. She's also chair of the Research Ethics Committee under the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. She currently holds an NIH Career Development Award studying the genetic data sharing market, and her work focuses on the secondary research use of health data and biospecimens. She's a former associate director of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues under President Obama, and a former practicing biotech attorney. And again, please ask questions using the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen and vote for your favorite questions. Okay, so the articles that you wrote, Holly, your target article, and the articles this month address access to unproven drugs for COVID. There are several different pathways, as we've just mentioned, outside of clinical trials, such as through expanded access programs or compassionate use, and they can also gain access through emergency use authorization. Before we talk specifically about COVID, though, let's talk a bit about these pathways. Recent years have seen an increase in both individual patient and patient advocacy groups pushing for access to unproven drugs for serious or life-threatening conditions, including the rise of state and now federal right to try laws. If there are no other treatments available for a terrible disease, should patients have a right to unproven interventions if they meet some minimal safety threshold, such as a phase 1 trial? I'm going to ask that question of Holly first.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for having us here. And I do just want to kind of acknowledge my co-authors on the Target article, Jamie Webb and Leisha Shah. So, to your question about, should patients ever be able to access unproven interventions before FDA has kind of given them the green light for marketing approval, I think the answer is yes. I'm supportive of expanded access as a regulatory pathway because it includes relevant safeguards. The way that our system is set up with FDA requiring pre-market authorization before products can be made available outside of clinical trials, generally speaking, and the length of time it takes to get products through trials and the FDA approval process means that some patients, if they had to wait, would die waiting. So it does make sense to have these exceptional opportunities for pre-approval access, with the key safeguard being that we protect the ability to run those rigorous clinical trials that you were mentioning previously. So the expanded access regulations do have built in that safeguard that you cannot participate in a clinical trial of the requested drug. And we'll talk about how that relates to clinical trials of other drugs, I think probably later in the program. Some other safeguards are built into the expanded access regulatory pathway too. There has to be an independent determination by FDA that the benefits outweigh the risks of providing access to that investigational product outside of a trial, mechanisms for adequate informed consent. And I think another important safeguard is the collection of at least safety data and some basic outcomes data for patients who are accessing products outside of clinical research studies. And there's a lot of attention to real world evidence. This is not going to be a substitute for that rigorous clinical trial data, but at least it's something for patients who might not be eligible for clinical trials. We can learn about a broader swath of patients. And then the other safeguard is just fairness and access. So we have this regulatory pathway, but it's not necessarily available in practice to everybody who might be able to benefit from it. So if it's only available to the most privileged patients, that's a problem. And then the last thing I'll say is that we should be careful not to call it a right to unproven interventions, and that's where things kind of went off the rails with regard to the right to try movement, right? This idea that patients should be able to try whatever they and their physicians decide might be in their interests. Expanded access gives you that right in terms of what FDA permits, but I don't think that you necessarily have a right to demand from a company that they provide access to their investigational drugs. So it is and has been under expanded access a right to ask, and that's what I'm supportive of.
Okay, thanks. Kate, thoughts on this issue?
Sure. So I'm in agreement with everything that Holly said. I find it helpful to sort of look at it via sort of two classic frameworks of bioethics, one being clinical ethics and the other being public health ethics. And from a clinical ethics perspective, I am totally and fully supportive of patients in conjunction with their physicians assessing the risks and the benefits of using a drug or device via the expanded access pathway. Of course, the third party to that, as Holly pointed out, is the pharmaceutical company, and they have to weigh all sorts of pros and cons and access to product and time spent. But as a former practicing pharmaceutical attorney, I assure you they are well protected and represented. So I think the really important thing comes down to, again, what Holly said, is ensuring equity, that all patients have access to these drugs if they need them at the end of their lives. The second point is sort of the public health point of, yes, but in many situations, the data for future patients is as much of value as access for that one individual patient. So particularly if you're thinking about it in the COVID context, sure, I think that patients that might otherwise die of COVID should have access to interventions for which we don't have much data. However, when that patient's wife gets hospitalized 2 weeks later with the same thing, I would hope that we have learned something such that we can care for her better. And so I think splitting them up in those two ways is helpful. And David, in your sort of opening article, you argued, the collective consequences of individual decisions have serious repercussions. And I think that's a great way of putting it, which is why in our article, we sort of focused on the diverse pathways of access, right? Randomized clinical trial, expanded access, or emergency use authorization and right to try, in that order in terms of data collection. And that's where I really think the rubber hits the road in public health equity.
Thanks. Barbara, your thoughts? Oh, you're muted. Barbara, you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I don't disagree with any of this. I agree with everything that Holly and Kate have said. I guess and the devil is in the details, right? So, it changes depending on how much one knows. It changes based on the safety and what we can hypothesize. It changes on whether this is indeed a scarce drug, but ideally we'd have well-powered, well-thought-out, cooperative, multi-trials that give us answers. And insofar as we have seen a proliferation of underpowered, single-site, poorly designed trials in COVID, a lot of this gets very complicated. That said, I don't disagree with any of the sort of principles that that Holly and Kate have put out, or your introduction. I think it's absolutely right.
Thanks. We'll come back to a particular example in convalescent plasma as an illustration in a little bit. But Kate, in your piece, you raised concerns that the existence of all these pathways actually does create the potential for increasing disparities and injustice, which all of you just mentioned in your comments. Could you elaborate on that? And especially, so saying that we recognize that these pathways are okay, but they raise these equity challenges, how do we really address that? I mean, it does seem that it's almost built into the nature of the way these processes are built at the current time. So, so can you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So, as we all know, there are really horrific racial disparities affecting the COVID response and who's getting sick and who's dying. But just to sort of put us all on the same page with a couple examples, in the state of Michigan is about 13.5% Black, and 32% of those hospitalized with COVID have been Black, and 41% of our deaths are of Black citizens. In New Mexico, 11% of their population is Native American, but they represent 37% of their cases and 26% of their deaths. And in the state of Washington, which is 13% Latino, it represents 42% of their cases. So this is a big deal. And so in our article, we focus on a couple of things. One of the things is something that you touched on, David, in your introduction here, but the expanded access programs, right? So originally, Gilead Pharmaceuticals had been offering sort of individual expanded access, which they quickly changed over to setting up expanded access programs for entire institutions, which made a lot of sense in terms of the pharmaceutical company not having enough time to sort of individually review and instead doing it by program. And so then at that point, individual EA access was only available for people who are pregnant and for pediatric patients. And, but U of M actually never even had an expanded access program because we had access to the clinical trial and we were offering remdesivir clinical trials. But this idea that any institution, so individuals could access remdesivir, using that as an example, through a clinical trial at our institution. They could access it through expanded access if they didn't qualify through one of the clinical trials, because we have a robust expanded access program team, which is perhaps one of the most robust ones in the country, where we have people who are devoted, their entire jobs are devoted to negotiating expanded access with pharmaceutical companies. They have a research ethicist on the team, which is me. We have a clinical ethicist. I mean, it's a very robust team. And not all these hospitals have the ability to advocate for individual patients in these ways. So that can have a disparate impact. The other one that I wanted to specifically highlight is the idea of like facially neutral policies, right, that have a disproportionate impact. So in law school, Holly and I actually went to the same law school. So in law school, we're taught that, if a person can establish that a rule has a disproportionate impact on them on the basis of a protected class, that they have a case. And they don't actually need to prove that the party that made the rule intended to discriminate. But now, fortunately, we actually know better, that not intending to discriminate isn't actually good enough. And just saying, well, the policy is facially neutral can actually be part of structural racism and feed into that topic. So the example that we talked about in our article was the remdesivir exclusion criteria for the clinical trial was severe renal impairment. So of course that makes sense, because one of the side effects of remdesivir is renal impairment, and one of the side effects of COVID is renal impairment. So it's really important to try to control for renal impairment in the first place at baseline. However, we also know that Black patients are 4 times more likely to be affected by renal impairment than our white patients. And our Black patients are 5 times as likely to be hospitalized with COVID as our white patients. So that's an example of a facially neutral policy that really had a disparate impact. And I think Dr. Jefferson argued it best in her article, and I'm going to quote her when she said, "The impact of this pandemic is so racialized, so how can our response be race neutral?" And the argument in favor of not just a facially neutral review of policies, but actually an anti-racist review of policies. So we didn't argue that, but that was fantastic, because that gave us the language we should have used in ours, and we will next time.
Thanks. Holly, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going to agree with what we just heard Kate articulate. There is really abysmal data about who gets expanded access in terms of demographic information, about where they're located around the country, racial and ethnic data, gender data, age data. All of that is really lacking. And so that would be the first step in trying to assess fairness of the availability of this pathway. Right before we all went on lockdown, I had wrapped up some interviews with oncologists at Penn and at CHOP who had submitted at least one expanded access request through our IRB. So they were not COVID-specific requests, And then we interviewed them and asked them, how do they make these decisions? What was the process like for them? And without exception, they said, God, I'm so lucky that I've got this whole regulatory staff of people here who's able to do the process for me. I fill out a little bit of information about the patient, I hand it off to our regulatory team, and they do the rest. But if I had to do this all on my own, there's no way I would be making expanded access requests on behalf of my patients with the regularity that I do. And then sometimes the conversation would go towards, do you think you're treating all of your patients fairly? And again, kind of without exception, they would say, yes, of course, right? But by the time the patients get to the oncologist at Penn or CHOP, those are different patients than folks who are being seen at, community hospitals or less well-resourced centers that might not even know expanded access is a thing, right? And so you need to have some awareness of this regulatory pathway, some help knowing, how do I go to the pharma company? What do I ask FDA for? There is, within the oncology space, something called Project Facilitate, which is kind of the pet project of the oncology division there in Cedar. And that does have the intention of improving education around this pathway and making it as easy as possible for physicians to do this for their patients. There's no reason that shouldn't be, I think, expanded to other disease areas. Infectious disease is another area of frequent expanded access requests. So certainly we want a fair distribution of expanded access, but I want to be careful about suggesting that we want a lot of expanded access. I don't think we want a lot of expanded access. I think we want more diverse trial eligibility criteria, right, as the first order of business, and then as little expanded access as possible, but fairly distributed.
Okay, thanks. Barbara?
So I just add a few things. I agree with, again, everything that has been said. The thing that's compelling to me is that COVID-19 has shined a light on this incredible racial and ethnic disparity embedded in systemic racism and systematic racism. And I think, which in a way, I think is going to have a positive impact on how we think about our healthcare system and the problems that we've faced for many, many years. But none of this is new. If you look at the data from long before COVID-19, Black and brown people have been underrepresented in clinical trials for as long as there has been data. If you look at the FDA snapshots from 2015, 2016, the first time that they looked at the data, and of course there are issues with that data because it's only the data from the registration trials of the drugs in that year. So if you have 3 large breast cancer trials, it looks like there's no problem with women. And if you have 5 prostate cancer drugs, it can look like there's a problem with women. So yes, there are those exigencies, but when you look at the oncology and cardiovascular diseases therapeutic areas for the registration trials, the number of Black and African-American patients was less than 3%. Even though we know that the incidence is higher, the severity is higher, and the death rate is higher. So we're not seeing something new here. And I can give you chapter and verse about some of that. Interestingly, in the same year, that was not true of psychiatric disease. There were 24% Black and African-American patients in the psychiatric disease as a therapeutic area. So we've seen that there is an incredible disparity. And that is embedded in our healthcare system and embedded in who gets to the hospital, who's defined as an essential worker, who gets to academic medical centers versus not, who's defined as an essential worker now. The fact that we don't collect a lot of the data that would be helpful for fixing this problem. And that is also true in the distribution of high-end drugs. Once they're approved with all the best, RCT and data and all the rest of it, it's not a fair allocation of prescriptions because we've got an unfair insurance system that undergirds healthcare in this country. So I think a lot of these problems are embedded in the way that we have set up the system and sort of what our healthcare has given us, and also in the data that we have in terms of health, safety and efficacy. And I agree with Holly that I wouldn't want to see an increase in the expanded access programs in order to compensate for that. I think we need data about what the safety and efficacy is for all populations. And some of that will be pre-approval, some of that will be post-approval and phase 4 or post-market real world data collection and analysis, and lots of commitments that we can talk about.
Thanks. Let's talk specifically about convalescent plasma as an illustration. Most of the early access to convalescent plasma was not through the handful of relatively small randomized clinical trials, but through the large expanded access program that wound up distributing convalescent plasma to over 100,000 patients. Ironically, in the population, namely critically ill patients who are least likely to benefit a priori. What are your thoughts about this expanded access program?
I don't know who you want to start. I can say that I think that, there were probably 99,000 patients too many in that expanded access program, and that, that the part of the problem in thinking about it. Now, I have to say, I don't know the inside data of what was submitted to the FDA and, sort of what that data looks like. What I do know is that there was a prior hypothesis that this is probably safe and not dangerous to give people. And we were faced with an epidemic or pandemic where we had very few options for what we could give people as physicians. And when you're sitting in that situation, there's a tendency to want to do something rather than do nothing. And I think we need to resist that and get data. But I think the trials that were offered at the time were small, underpowered, and problematic. And, if we had put the same effort into really well done trials with the convalescent plasma, would be in a very different setting today. So I think it's unfortunate. I think that there should be a limit in terms of how we think about the value of EA, expanded access programs. And again, I would separate the piece from, after the phase 3 data to approval. I think we should just take that out of the setting, because by that time you really do know whether it's going to be effective.
So just to summarize, in this case, you think that having this huge expanded access program did in fact have a negative impact potentially on other trials that we could have done. We didn't learn anything. Okay, good. Holly?
Yeah, I would just add, I'm blown away with what we witnessed with this expanded access protocol. I mean, 100,000 patients, and we still don't know the answer. It's the opposite of what the standard is supposed to be for expanded access, right? That it's not supposed to interfere with clinical development or with trials that would enable us to answer the question about whether the product is safe and effective. And so interestingly, I think this is an example where we had this catch-22, where patients were eligible for the expanded access program because they couldn't be in trials, but they couldn't be in trials because those trials had such difficulty getting up and running, in part because of this massive expanded access program, right? So I think it highlights the importance of, with convalescent plasma being an interesting example, because there's not a sponsor for this product, right? And so it requires, I think, other funding sources to step up to the plate to say, we're going to fund trials of this product. So BARDA came in and said, we'll fund the expanded access program. Well, why not fund clinical trials, right? That would have gotten us the answer to the question. And I know I've seen arguments where the expanded access program made the product available at sites that were never going to run a trial. Great. let them have the expanded access program and fund trials at sites that have the capacity to do that. So I have a lot of frustration, frankly, maybe it might be obvious in my tone about this, that, you know, FDA didn't step in to say, okay, you know, this has gotten way out of control, and that funders didn't step in to say, okay, we've got to actually fund randomized clinical trials at this stage to figure out the answer. And then we have this emergency use authorization, and we kind of have to throw up our hands and say, are we ever going to know at this point?
Not in this country.
Yeah, thanks. Fortunately, there are other countries. Kate, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I have thoughts. So I will direct my thoughts. I think Barbara and Holly covered other parts very well, but I'll direct my thoughts to the preprint specifically, and in particular, the paragraph where they discuss justifications of not designing a randomized controlled clinical trial. And I will say that I think some of the justifications really make sense, particularly at the beginning of this when they launched it. But I have concerns specifically about two of the ethical justifications in that ethics paragraph. One is they argue that they didn't design a randomized control trial because there's no global consensus of what a placebo is, right? And I would suggest that the authors perhaps strike that argument because, of course, how can we establish a standard of care for research when the research is being done to establish a standard of care? It's sort of cyclically illogical. That's one point. And the other is, so I'll just quote that COVID patients, so this is another reason why they didn't do an RCT, COVID patients would likely have been distrustful of being randomized to a placebo based on historical precedent. So the argument, as I understand it, is the randomization is the problem that's causing the mistrust, right? Because they're saying our research was fine, but had we randomized, that would have seeded mistrust. So it's the randomization part that is problematic. But as someone who has spent a lot of time on the history of research ethics in this country, these trials weren't randomized, right? Like think about Tuskegee, think about Guatemala, think about Henrietta Lacks, think about the Nazi experiments. The problem with those weren't randomization. They weren't randomized controlled trials. So I'm not sure that the randomization component is what's actually seeding mistrust, because the problem with those trials wasn't randomization, it was racism and bigotry. And so I would instead suggest that we as institutions act in trustworthy ways to encourage trust, which involves focusing on eradicating racism and rather than randomization.
Thanks. There are. I'm going to go to most of the questions from the audience at the end, but there were a couple very specific to plasma that I want to really raise here that are related. One person says plasma is not a drug and doesn't have a sponsor. What kind of special considerations does that introduce? And another said, do the speakers think the problems with trials for convalescent plasma, do they result from the fact that convalescent plasma is not patented and the trials were not sponsored by a commercial sponsor? How many of the lame trials were funded by NIH? And does that really is part of the key difference here that made it worse or exacerbated it, the fact that it isn't a drug, it's this other kind of product? How much of a role did that play in this sort of, in a way, disaster? Barbara, you want to go first?
Well, I can go first, but I think it certainly played a significant role in why this got out of hand, because anybody can create it, validate it, and give it. And there's no control point to say enough is enough. We're not going to give it out again until there is data collection, and this is what it is. And there is no authority necessarily to do that unless one of our government authorities had stepped in some way. And that didn't happen. And when they did, they came in with the EUA, an emergency use authorization. That's very unlike remdesivir, for instance, which was only available with data collection. And then after a certain effort, they sort of shut that down and said, randomized trials. And they started that going on forward. And, you know, Kate, the issue of how to design that for drugs that are available outside of an expanded access program or outside a clinical trial, because they're post-approval, we've got the same problem that a doctor can say, will you be randomized or do you want the drug? And, you know, and that's another problem with the fact that we as physicians have authority to prescribe off-label for the individual patient. Certain other countries don't have that. So, you know, I think this is a significant underlying problem.
Okay, great. Holly?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when Barbara says there was no authority to stop this, the government just failed to exercise it, yes. Right? And so it's frankly, I think, another item in the long list of government failures in response to this pandemic, right? So we have mechanisms for the government to sponsor research, even when there's not a company that's going to eventually profit from the marketing of a drug. BARDA could have spent the money that it spent on the expanded access program on clinical trials, right? Or, you know, we could have had NIH funded clinical trials. And I think there was some discussion of that. I obviously have no inside information either. And I don't know what the decision-making process was to not pursue those trials, or for FDA to not come in and say, look, our regulatory standards are no longer being satisfied here. The regulations require non-interference with clinical development, and an expanded access program of 100,000 people is clearly going to interfere with our ability to get the data that is critical to be able to have informed decision-making, both by patients and by their clinical care team, about whether they want to try this product versus one of the many other products that's being studied for response to COVID.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say there was no authority, but there was no control point for access to the product.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So as I said, the government didn't step in, and there was no one. Yeah.
Do you think that this right decision was made to create the emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma? One at a time. So
I do. I mean, I think, look, the legal standard is extraordinarily low for an emergency use authorization. Unlike traditional marketing approval, in which there has to be some demonstration of safety and efficacy for the intended use, the EUA standard is may be effective, and known and potential benefits outweigh known and potential risks. But the EUA standard is a discretionary legal standard, meaning just because it's satisfied does not mean that FDA has to issue the EUA. For a traditional marketing approval, you have an entitlement. If you're a sponsor and you put forth the relevant evidence and you meet the legal standard, then FDA they have a legal responsibility to issue your product approval. EUA is not like that. So FDA could have said, yes, there's a plausible argument that the legal standard has been met here, but we are going to not issue the EUA because we want to actually make sure that we can answer the questions about safety and effectiveness. And that's what that's what government scientists outside FDA said, right? There was this whole kerfuffle where Fauci and others were saying, not yet on the EUA. Now, they didn't have the authority to stop it because they're not at FDA. So I think the legal standard was met, but the timing makes it such that it becomes impossible to know whether FDA was doing this because they actually thought it was in the benefit of the American people, or it was because Trump tweeted the day before that deep state interests at FDA were trying to avoid him getting reelected, and we're sitting on convalescent plasma for that reason, right? The timing and the optics of that were extraordinarily poor.
But again, we saw that the expanded access program hindered clinical trials, emergency use authorization would seem to make it even potentially worse.
Yes, it eliminates the possibility of conducting a clinical trial.
So that sort of goes to whether or not this was really a good idea.
Exactly right.
I mean, I agree with all that's been said. I would just add that I feel like this keeps happening to us, being the US, in our COVID response, where we are in a position where we're making bad decisions on the basis of the fact that we've already made bad decisions. So this is assuming that there was some introspection and foresight at FDA, and Holly, as you mentioned, that might not have been the case, and I think we have to be really careful, and this is something that ethicists are faced with a lot. Are we just responding to a bad situation in a bad way, or are we actually alleviating this? And I guess the analogy I would use is our overall response to the pandemic and preventing spread and infection control and contact tracing. The fact that apparently our new position is we just need to wait for a vaccine, because there's no hope for this country until we can get a vaccine, because we can't possibly expect people to mask up and limit gatherings. And I see that kind of sort of individualistic I forget who made this point before, but doctors, Barbara, doctors want to act, right? They don't want to not act. And so this individualistic, we want to protect people to do whatever they want, and then we will act affirmatively with a vaccination, but everybody's horrified that we ask people to act in small ways that would prevent the need of the vaccination. So that's a different kind of example, but I feel like it's relevant to the plasma emergency use authorization, because again, we're just in a position where everything has been structured poorly, and we're trying to still pull our Jenga pieces out of the top with, and everything's going to topple, but that doesn't mean that everything was okay leading up to it.
So I just don't want to be misinterpreted there. I think that you're putting people in a difficult position if you're not offering physicians a well-designed trial that is likely to answer a question, which we didn't, and then say, no, you can't give something that we think might help. Because you're watching people die. The natural response is to do something. If you said, look, you can participate in a clinical trial, and we've done this in a way, in a master protocol, so that within 2 months we'll have the answer as to whether this helps or doesn't, that is acting. But we didn't do that. And including the fact that when we go back and look at remdesivir data, for instance, we don't know who got dexamethasone and who didn't. So, so we've got huge problems, and I couldn't agree more about the fact that part of those problems are built on the current situation, or troubled by the current situation of politicizing science in a way that is inescapable in our evaluation of this. But I just wanted to be clear that it's not that doctors need to act, incoherently. It's that we need to give people tools to be able to contribute to a future that is different than today.
Yeah, no, I totally understood that and completely agree. I guess I was referring more to your latter point, that unfortunately, I think too many clinicians misinterpret enrollment on clinical trials as a inaction, as opposed to an affirmative action as a clinician.
Yeah.
I also just want to add that we've done something unfair to clinicians in response to COVID by now saying, okay, we're going to issue this emergency use authorization when we still don't know whether the product works. And now you have to decide how to treat your patients without having adequate information, or decide as an institution that you're going to run your own clinical trials and try to keep your patients only enrolling in clinical trials. It really puts physicians in an untenable situation, and we should have had a more systematic response that would have relieved that burden from their shoulders. I mean, on top of all the other burdens that they're bearing in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the point about, emergency use authorizations. Once that's been given, you also rob the physician of the ability to say, this is the only way we're going to get the answer, because it's approved for the use in this window and, by the FDA. And then what are you going to do?
This is great. Now let's turn to the issue of access. When expanded access programs or compassionate use exceptions are available, it's usually the case that the interventions can't be offered to all patients, since it's usually not widely available. How should decisions be made about who has access? Holly?
Great. So this is the subject, direct subject of the target article that we had published in the American Journal of Bioethics. And so we argue that allocation decisions, both under expanded access programs and emergency use authorization in the face of scarcity, should be based on three overarching principles that are familiar in the context of ethics more generally: minimizing harm, maximizing benefit, and promoting fairness. And in the context of minimizing harm, we emphasize the importance of making sure that allocation of these investigational drugs, when we lack strong evidence about their safety and effectiveness, won't interfere with data collection. That's really got to be the highest priority, is getting that information. But the part that I think is more controversial is that we argue not only should patients have to if they're going to get access through expanded access or emergency use authorization, not only should they be ineligible for clinical trials of the requested drug, but they also would get reduced priority if they decline to participate in a clinical trial of a comparable product, right? So we want to make sure that allocation is not interfering with studies for that drug or studies for other drugs that might end up actually being more beneficial than the requested product. Okay, so we basically say if you're eligible for some clinical trial that offers a comparable risk-benefit ratio to the investigational product that you're seeking access for, you would get reduced priority for allocation of that scarce investigational product. And that's a way of minimizing harm. The next criterion is maximizing benefit. And again, this comes back to trying to get as much data as we possibly can. And so if we're thinking about scarce products, the argument that we make is that we should prioritize allocation to treatment protocols that are able to treat multiple patients within a single site, for example, and prioritize that over single patient requests for expanded access. That will facilitate data collection, this kind of real world evidence production. And then the third principle is fairness. And this relates to what Kate and others have been talking about with regard to anti-racism, right? So it's not just a matter of saying, oh, we're going to have fair allocation of those who request to have a treatment protocol, an expanded access treatment protocol at their site. Those are likely to be the most well-resourced academic medical centers and not, you know, the safety net hospitals or the community hospitals that are treating patients that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And so that will require companies and the government to put some supports in place to allow sites that wouldn't normally be running these treatment protocols or have emergency use authorization drug allocated to them to have those supports built in so we can have a fair distribution of access to the patients who have been disproportionately impacted by the disease in question here, being COVID-19.
Any thoughts? Or we're starting to get a little bit pressed for time, and we've got a lot of other questions. So I'm actually going to turn to a slightly different issue. So in your view about access, one of the criteria are that you've argued for is that patients who've declined to be enrolled in clinical trials with similar risk-benefit profiles should be given a lower priority for access to drugs through expanded access programs. Can you first just say a little bit about that argument?
Sure. Again, right, so the regulatory standard for expanded access talks about not interfering with trials of that drug, but you could also have interference with trials of other products, right? So if you have very easy access to convalescent plasma, for example, maybe you're less willing to participate in a randomized trial of some other drug that in fact might be more promising than convalescent plasma. So I want to focus on the fact that if we are fairly confident about the drug that you are requesting, then you don't get dinged if you're unwilling to participate in other clinical trials. I'm not suggesting that we withhold access to things that we're fairly confident about. It's for those products that we're still really unsure about their efficacy or their safety. And so the argument is that we want to prioritize data collection across all of the different types of drugs that might be, or products, investigational products that might be considered for COVID-19. And so there's some, concern that how will we be able to tell what products are comparable? I think we do this in the context of clinical trial design when we think about equipoise and what might be the appropriate comparison arms for clinical trials. So if I'm a patient and I want to access drug A, and there's a possible drug B that might be similar, the question is, could we actually run a clinical trial in which drug A and drug B are both run in the same trial compared to placebo, right? We would say all three of those, if we allowed that kind of trial to proceed, would be in equipoise with one another. So that's all I'm arguing, is that if it would be reasonable to ask you to be randomized to that other product, in a trial, that if you could participate in a trial that would give you access to drug B, then you should get reduced priority for drug A outside of a clinical trial. And there are some racial equity considerations that come up in that context, right, where we're saying we should prioritize willingness to enroll in trials because some populations have very good reasons not to enroll in clinical trials. There's also concern about voluntariness of clinical trial participation, where the idea of being dinged if you're unwilling to participate in a study might raise concerns about whether you're being coerced or unduly induced to participate in research. And there, just in the interest of time, I'll say we do this already in the existing regulatory standards, where we say you have to be willing to participate in a trial of the drug you're requesting, right? People might have good reasons not want to be in that trial. And if it's not coercive to say you've got to be in that trial if you want that drug, I don't think it becomes any more coercive to say if you want drug A and drug B is comparable, you have to be willing to participate in drug B.
Barb, makes sense. Barbara, I know you disagree with this, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
so the first thing I'd say is that you do a lot of work, Holly, with the word comparable, and I don't think that's an easy. I think you need to unpack that medically in order to say that this has any sort of, or not any, but that's really a fair supposition. And I can tell you that a group of 10 of us tried to find 2 drugs that were comparable to make the argument that comparative effectiveness research need not sort of undergo the traditional, voluntariness of assent or consent, and could not find it. So this idea that drugs are comparable, I think, and the net benefit, the idea of net benefit, is problematic at the outset, number one. Number two, you remove the fact, and you really, I think, undermine the sense of voluntariness. And I think we would have a further problem with trust in medicine and in clinical research if we start dinging people for choosing not to be part of a clinical trial that we allege should respect autonomy and should be voluntary. So that's the second problem. And in fact, at some hospitals that offer a trial, you would need to go to it. You would, so you could go across the street and get the drug anyway. And you've made a distinction around drugs that have not been approved for other purposes and drugs that are approved for other purposes, but used in a new indication. So that's another sort of dimension of this. And then overlying all of that is this issue of racial and ethnic injustice, which I think needs to be considered in this aspect. If we say that we're gonna, and I agree with a lot of the points about, maximizing benefit, minimizing harm, the importance of data collection and fairness, but in some of these, in some of the health centers, you would need to really figure out how to get the data with the quality that we would in some other places. I think we need to do that as a society, independent of COVID-19, but I don't think we should, sort of, if data collection is the highest order value, we've got additional problems by saying we're going to give drug to places that are not currently able to provide the data. I also think it puts people in a very difficult position when you decide that autonomy is no longer an equal leg in the 3 or 4-legged stool, but rather is compromised. Then we've got a ton of sort of practical questions. How long do you get dinged for? You know, do you get dinged for the rest of your life? Can you volunteer but then decide not to and withdraw? And then are you still getting dinged? Do you get credit if your family member was in a clinical trial and you're not? Do you know, so I can spin about 45 other easy ones. And the one that's currently at, you know, sort of the one that we were confronted with as, you know, at Brigham Health, for instance, is that you can currently get tested as part of a clinical trial, but only if you agree to give your identified sample to the biobank for future use. Well, so you've got a whole other set of underlying questions of fairness and identity. So, I mean, I can continue, but I think we've got a basic disagreement.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I just want to respond before we lose the thread. I'm sure Kate has something to add as well, but just to respond, can't respond to all of those points. But I do think if we're worried about voluntariness and autonomy in expanded access, if the argument was extended not only to the drug of interest, but to other comparable drugs, then we have a deep problem with the current regulatory approach to expanded access, in which we do demand that people be willing to participate in clinical trials or forego their non-trial access to the requested drug, right? I mean, we are saying to people right now, you want, you know, take your pick of unapproved COVID products. You want it in expanded access, there's a trial you're eligible for, you have to participate in the trial or you cannot get expanded access. So if coercion is the problem, or, you know, breach of autonomy is the problem, then we have a much bigger problem, and we would have to be willing to sacrifice the data. And so our argument is really just extending the current principle that's applicable for expanded access, in which we prioritize data collection.
Kate, you get to decide you get to be the deciding vote.
So David asked me to be the tiebreaker, and so I'm going to refer back to my training, my media training, when I was in the government, and answer not the question I was asked, but the question I wish I had been asked. And we'll say that was an excellent conversation. And I think the most important thing that we should take from this is the importance of different trainings, kinds of training, when we come to these really thorny clinical, legal, ethical issues, right? Because I think often when I'm working with clinical colleagues, that perhaps not enough thought is put into a sort of legal or policy implications of individual patient decisions if we run it out over the entire institution. And speaking as an attorney, often I can say things that really sound good in theory, but you know, then I tell my clinical colleagues exactly what they should do. And they're like, yeah, but Kate, like that, you know, that item is kept in a closet that's 3 floors away. So there's actually no possibility that I just reach for that item, right? Like these sort of applied and practical considerations in conjunction with policy is exactly why we're all here. And I hope that these kinds of conversations are able to go on across the country.
Okay. I'm going to now turn to some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. So the most popular question right now: during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, the advisory body discussed offering the experimental treatments in randomized control trials, with ordinary care being given to those not randomized to the intervention. The representatives from Africa said that such an approach was not only unethical because the two arms are not in or not perceived as being in equipoise, but also impractical. Randomization would produce more robust data, but no participants would not join, or a riot would ensue because ordinary care was so ineffective. How does that compare to COVID-19 convalescent plasma in your view? I'll let any of you take a shot.
I mean, I guess I'll give it a slight go. I'm not sure whether Alex is referring to, because the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues I was on at the time put out a report. There was also an NIH one, both of which were fairly similar in recommending standard of care. I will say, obviously, as many of us know, there's a long history of debate over what the standard of care should be in particularly countries other than the US when US researchers are doing the trials. And the general consensus has been that certainly you cannot go abroad to do a trial with the intent that one can use nothing as a standard of care and thus make your data more robust. And it doesn't have to be a comparative clinical trial. It can instead be, again, standard of care. So, you know, using a little bit of casuistry, like we know that. I think what makes this potentially different in the Ebola case is that the intent of the research was to help the communities that were affected by it. And I think a good example of this is in the 1990s when we were discussing, well, I wasn't discussing, but I read discussions about, you know, balancing standard of care in the maternal fetal transmission HIV/AIDS trials and what should be given to the control arm. And a major argument was, but we're trying to benefit a community that could not otherwise afford the standard of care. So we're trying to design a trial that actually could be of use to them. So I guess I would just give a little bit of that background about at least my experience on one of those government advisory bodies during Ebola and sort of our thoughts.
I think partly what Alex is getting at, though, is unlike the AZT maternal fetal transmission trials, there was an effective standard of care in the US that was not widely available in those less developed countries. In the Ebola outbreak, there was no widely accepted standard of care, whether in the US or in any African nations, that really offered benefit. And so the argument I think that Alex is talking about was the concern that people said that, look, when people are dying and this is this terrible disease, you can't give somebody a placebo when even if you don't have any evidence that the intervention works, you have to give it to them. There were a lot of people making arguments like that during the Ebola outbreak. So if people were making those arguments then, were they just wrong? Or is COVID's situation different, since we're really arguing that same kind of reasoning, which would say, yeah, we should have done, if nothing else works to treat COVID, then of course we should have these massive expanded access programs for convalescent plasma and give 100,000 of them. That's the right thing to do because we don't have an adequate treatment. So what's different between the Ebola case so either the people making those arguments wrong about Ebola, or is it that there's something different between the two that would justify the view that I think we've all agreed upon for convalescent plasma through expanded access programs?
Yeah. I mean, I think the situations are quite similar. People have published about the similarities between the arguments that were made in the context of Ebola and COVID. I think the arguments were wrong in the context of Ebola, right? First of all, we're not saying for COVID, give them convalescent plasma or let them die on the street. No one is saying that, right? We're saying give them convalescent plasma plus standard of care, or give them standard of care only. And it's not like we don't have any idea what to do, right? I mean, there's lots of things, supportive care that is helpful in the context of COVID. We don't have some alternative cure, obviously, but this idea, we saw this argument play out in the context of convalescent plasma. Give it to everybody who could conceivably benefit. And now we don't know the answer, and we're not sure that they in fact benefited. I know, certainly Alex knows this. There's all sorts of arguments about problems with equipoise as a standard for what's required for ethical research. But where you do have equipoise, I think it's really a helpful argument here. You don't know that convalescent plasma is better than some of the alternatives that maybe were paths not taken for those patients who were in the convalescent plasma expanded access program. It's not clear that we did anybody any favors by, funneling so many people into a non-randomized trial. It gets to Kate's concern about people's trust in randomization. I mean, I see Alex's point about would people riot? Would people be willing to participate in that kind of research? The answer then is not to do bad quality trials, the answer is to help people understand why it's ethical to randomize.
I guess I would take a slightly different view. You know, I think that it reflects a lack of national commitment and organization. And that if we had really done this right, we would have done a master protocol where we're looking at convalescent plasma versus dexamethasone, where we're looking at convalescent plasma versus something else that is equally likely to be effective. But
that means there's comparable products, Barbara, by the way.
No, it doesn't mean comparable products. You can then have a master protocol that has multiple different arms and people can still decide not to be part of it. I do think that in the Ebola situation, you know, people were dying 100% of the time, or maybe that's an exaggeration, pretty much. And in the early days of COVID-19, you know, people were coming into the hospital and the mortality was significant, but not 100%. But you know, we had ICU tents in the garden in Boston. So I think that the people who lived through that are sensitive to the idea that we would not offer anything. Even if you were gonna offer something, you had to give people a choice of feeling that we could do something other than nothing. And that depends on the risk and benefit of what your intervention is, as you've outlined well.
So another question asks, it seems like a theme here is that there should be more data collection analysis for the benefit of groups disproportionately affected as well as others, and we need that happen in a timely manner. What, if anything, can ethicists do to facilitate this data collection analysis? And then they also point out people with disabilities have also been underrepresented in clinical trials. So what do you think ethicists can do to help address these issues?
Well, I will say at our institution, because we've done a lot of work on this, I think a robust ethics service that has already established trust with an institution in which they work can actually do a lot of the work here, because, you know, clinicians are there to focus on the medicine, and the lawyers are there to focus on the laws. And at least in my experience, it has been somewhat alleviating of colleagues when someone who is there to focus on the ethics, they're specifically trained to focus on the ethics, they know the ethics literature, can come to the table and sort of somewhat absolve the burden of saying, no, you really need to do this, or no, you really can't do that because that's inappropriate. So I think, again, it's founded on this bedrock of trust. Like, you can't do that unless they trust you to begin with, which I know is challenging for many of my colleagues. But if you have access to that bedrock of trust, I think sort of taking on some of the burden of this kind of decision making in this gray space is something that could be helpful to your clinical colleagues.
So I would say a couple of things. One is I think that the decisions, you know, if possible, at this kind in situations of scarcity, should be taken out. Should be as transparent as possible, as communicated as possible, and if possible, be taken out of the treating clinician's hands. I think it's really hard to be facing somebody and delivering the kind of news that we're asking of them to do, and to revert to a set of quote principles when you're sitting there, you know, face to face or through a plexiglass screen in this case. So that's one thing. And I think that the ethicists can be helpful in sorting out what those balances are and how to think about the sort of implications and the values that we're placing on, and the sort of what's the underbelly here. What aren't we thinking about, to take a broader view, which I think is very helpful. I also think that we need, as a society, to commit to better comprehensive common data standards and better collection, because I think a lot of these problems could be answered through real world data if we collected the same data and had that be interoperable. And in fact, some of these trials might not be necessary if we had the appropriate control groups in counties and elsewhere that don't have it. I also would say one other thing, that I am now, in the last many months that I've been thinking about this, really convinced that we need not only an ethics lens, but an equity lens in what we do. And that, you know, we've had sort of, we haven't had that very sort of advertent lens that we should.
I just want to emphasize, ethicists talk about capacity building all the time when we're in other countries. Like, we don't need it here too. I mean, we obviously need to build capacity across a variety of different sites to allow this kind of data collection. So that's one kind of thing to do, is, you know, pay attention to our own backyards. And then the other, I think, is that ethicists can advocate for simple, high quality trial designs. And that gets to what Barbara was just talking about. You know, that's an advantage, I think, of the UK trials, is it's pretty easy for people to gather the type of data that they're looking for, and not these huge elaborate data sets that might be requested for sites that are in participating in some trials that are being launched here in the US.
We are almost out of time, so I hate to ask another big question that would take a long time to answer. So this is going to be, you only have one sentence to answer this question. One of the safeguards for the EUA pathway mentioned is a robust mechanism for adequate informed consent. Are there situations in which patients without the ability to consent for themselves, but among the most at risk for COVID, such as elderly patients with cognitive impairments, could participate in an expanded emergency use authorization programs? And if not, how might this conflict with the values of equity and access for vulnerable populations? So should we drop the consent standards to increase equity, or should we stick with the importance of informed consent as a critical safeguard in the emergency use authorization pathway?
So
oh, you go, Barbara, go ahead.
I guess I don't understand the question exactly, because if people really aren't able to make consent decisions for themselves, there is a legally authorized representative to do that for them. And I think that that is an important safeguard to maintain.
Yeah, I was just going to say the EUA standard is for informed consent is not meaningfully different, in my view, from clinical consent in the context of uncertainty. And so to the extent that you have people authorizing clinical care on a patient's behalf who can't consent for themselves, it would be the same for an EUA.
So as long as states have available to them the ability to have consent for research done through a surrogate in their state laws, then we would just use the same standards in those circumstances.
I would use it for clinical care, not even the research.
Clinical care, okay.
Yeah.
That's actually important, because it is sort of in some ways in that nether region. So it's
Right.
I think that's what makes it a little tricky.
I would just add that, so I saw there was another question about this sort of balance between equity and scientific rigor. And sort of the one sentence answer to that is, and I'm channeling Christine Grady, like, there's not a difference between equitable research and scientifically rigorous research. And if we feel like there is a tension between these two things, it's because the system needs to change, not the people.
That is a perfect last comment. So thank you so much for our panelists, and thank all of you in the audience, and for all of the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them, because there were a lot of fantastic questions. So thank you very much. And this will be available on the bioethics.net website. You'll be able to see in our YouTube channel if anybody wants to see a recording of this, and all of the articles in this issue of AJOB are freely available for people who want to access that at the American Journal of Bioethics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.